The first thing people noticed was the pipes. Three thick iron pipes protruding from the side of Gideon Mercer's cabin like the barrels of some buried machine. The second thing they noticed was the boiler. Rust-blackened, massive, old enough that most men assumed it belonged in a scrapyard, not attached to a home. And the third thing they noticed was Gideon welding it directly into the wall of his log cabin. That was when the laughter started. Planning to blow yourself into spring? That thing belongs on a locomotive. He's turned his house into a kettle. Gideon ignored them all, because unlike the others, he understood what the old steam boiler had been built to do. Hold heat. Not briefly, not delicately, relentlessly. For 40 years the boiler had powered a logging mill north of the valley before the machinery finally failed and the entire operation shut down. The boiler itself weighed nearly as much as a small cabin. Nobody wanted the trouble of moving it, except Gideon. He spent 2 weeks hauling it home with a mule team, timber rollers, and more stubbornness than wisdom. By the time he dragged it beside his cabin, half the valley had gathered just to watch him fail. Instead, he started rebuilding it. The boiler itself was a riveted iron cylinder nearly 8 feet long, scarred by decades of heat and pressure. Gideon stripped rust from the seams, replaced cracked valves, and cut away damaged sections until only the solid core remained. Then he did something nobody expected. He embedded half of it directly into the cabin wall. Not inside, not outside, both. The rear half of the boiler extended into the cabin beside a massive stone hearth. The front remained exposed outdoors beneath a timber awning where Gideon could feed fuel safely without carrying ash and smoke through the house. That confused people more than the boiler itself. Why keep the fire outside? So the heat stays inside, Gideon answered. Nobody understood that either. But Gideon had learned something years earlier working maintenance crews on rail lines through mountain winters. Most cabin heat escaped during refueling. Doors opened. Cold rushed in. Ash scattered. Smoke drifted indoors. Every trip to the stove invited winter directly inside the home. Gideon intended to stop inviting it. So he built differently. The boiler worked like a giant iron battery. He lined the indoor section with thick stone masonry that absorbed heat from the metal shell slowly over time. Water chambers inside the boiler no longer produced steam. They held thermal mass instead. Massive retained heat. That was the principle. Not quick warmth. Stored warmth. The valley didn't understand thermal storage any more than they understood why railroad engines stayed hot hours after fires died. They only saw a dangerous-looking machine bolted into a cabin wall. Too much iron freezes faster, Harlan Pike declared confidently one afternoon. Gideon didn't bother arguing, because iron alone wasn't the system. Mass was, water was, stone was, controlled fire was. Together, they changed everything. The work took until late autumn. Gideon reinforced the cabin floor near the hearth with extra stone supports. He packed clay insulation around pipe joints. He built narrow channels allowing warmth from the boiler casing to circulate naturally through the cabin without smoke entering the living space. By the first frost, the setup looked strange but deliberate. Outside, the old boiler sat beneath its snow-shedding awning like a retired locomotive buried halfway into the cabin itself. Iron feed doors faced outward beside stacked coal and split wood. Inside, thick stone radiated soft warmth even hours after testing fires ended. That part surprised Gideon most. Not that it worked. That it worked so well. He lit the first full burn during a freezing rainstorm in late October. The outdoor firebox roared steadily while water chambers inside the old boiler absorbed immense amounts of heat. The stonework around the interior shell warmed slowly but deeply. At first the cabin remained merely comfortable. Then the fire died low, and the warmth remained. Not sharp heat like a stove blasting one corner of a room. Balanced heat. The walls stayed warm. The floor stayed warm. The air stayed steady. Hours later, Gideon still sat comfortably in shirt sleeves while freezing rain hardened into ice outside his windows. That was when he knew the valley would eventually copy him. Winter always teaches faster than conversation. Caleb Turner visited first after hearing rumors. He entered the cabin cautiously, immediately looking for the giant stove everyone described. Instead, he found only warm stone, soft heat, and the faint metallic ticking of cooling iron behind the masonry wall. "Where's the fire?" Caleb asked. "Outside." Caleb frowned. "You're heating the whole place from outside?" "Mostly storing heat outside, Gideon corrected. He tapped the stone beside the embedded boiler casing. The cabin just borrows it slowly. Caleb pressed his palm against the masonry. Warm. Not hot. Steady. How long's it stay like this? Gideon shrugged. Depends how hard I charge the system. That sounds less like a cabin and more like an engine. Gideon smiled slightly. Engines survive winter too. Outside, the valley prepared for cold the usual way. Bigger wood piles. Thicker blankets stuffed into window cracks. Long nights feeding stoves every few hours. Inside Gideon's cabin, things worked differently. He burned hotter fires, but less often. One heavy evening burn charged the boiler, heated the water chambers, and saturated the masonry. Then the system released warmth gradually overnight. No constant feeding. No waking every few hours. No freezing mornings waiting for a stove to recover. The others noticed quickly, especially the smoke. Gideon's chimney burned hard for short periods, then nearly stopped while everyone else continued feeding fires endlessly through the night. That can't last, people insisted. But then November deepened. Snow arrived heavy. Wind came harder. Cabins across the valley began developing familiar winter problems. Cold floors, drafty walls, morning frost inside windows. Families crowding close to stoves while room corners remained freezing. Gideon's cabin stayed different. The stored heat reached everywhere slowly and evenly. The massive boiler retained temperature long after flames died down. Stone flooring near the hearth remained comfortable even before dawn. Most importantly, the warmth didn't vanish the moment weather worsened. One night during the season's first true freeze, Caleb returned carrying split wood for trade. He stepped inside and stopped immediately. The firebox outside had gone dark nearly an hour earlier. Yet the cabin still felt warmer than his father's kitchen beside a fully active stove. Caleb stared openly now. This thing's still heating the house. Gideon nodded toward the stone wall. Heat takes time to leave once you trap enough of it. Caleb looked around slowly. No smoke smell. No roaring fire. No frantic feeding. Just warmth quietly existing everywhere. That boiler's acting like a giant coal. Exactly. Outside, snow thickened across the valley. And 3 nights later, the blizzard arrived. The blizzard struck after midnight. Not gradually. Not politely. One moment the valley slept beneath steady snowfall. The next, wind slammed through the mountain pass hard enough to shake cabin shutters and rip loose snow from rooftops in white spirals. Inside Gideon Mercer's cabin, the storm sounded distant. Muted. The thick stone around the embedded boiler absorbed more than heat. It swallowed noise too. The iron shell ticked softly as stored warmth continued moving through the masonry. Gideon sat near the table reading while the boiler system released heat gathered hours earlier. No active fire burned. That alone would have sounded insane to the valley. Every other home would be feeding stoves constantly by now. Then came the pounding. Hard enough to rattle the cabin door. Gideon crossed the room and opened it carefully against the wind. Caleb Turner nearly fell inside under the force of the storm. Behind him came Mrs. Tolland wrapped in blankets with her grandson held tightly against her chest. Our chimney cracked, Caleb said through chattering teeth. Whole kitchen filled with smoke. Gideon shut the door fast. Immediately, the warmth settled around them again. Not sharp heat. Not roaring fire heat. Steady heat. The kind that felt like the cold simply no longer mattered. Mrs. Tolland looked around the room in disbelief. There's barely a fire. Doesn't need one right now, Gideon answered. Caleb stared at the stone wall surrounding the boiler casing. The masonry still radiated warmth hours after the flames outside had died. That thing's still holding heat. Gideon nodded. Boilers were built to survive mountain winters before cabins ever figured out how. Another knock came before Caleb could answer. Then another. By midnight, nearly 10 people crowded inside Gideon's cabin. Harlan Pike arrived after losing part of his roof to drifting snow. Old Mr. Wexler came because his stovepipe froze solid with ice. 2 Miller children showed up, wrapped together beneath a horse blanket, while their parents struggled to keep their own fire alive. Every newcomer entered expecting roaring flames. Instead they found calm. Warm floors, warm walls, warm air, and no desperate fight to maintain it. That unsettled them more than the storm outside. How's it still this warm? Harlan asked finally. Gideon pointed toward the embedded boiler. I heated the mass before the storm arrived. Harlan frowned. The what? The boiler. The water inside it. The stone around it. All of it stores heat. Mrs. Tolland touched the masonry carefully. Still warm. Deep warm. Not surface heat. It's like the whole cabin became a stove, she whispered. That's the idea. Outside, wind screamed harder against the valley. Snow hammered rooftops sideways. Somewhere beyond the storm came the distant crack of timber giving way under pressure. Inside the cabin, nobody moved closer to the walls. Nobody huddled beside the hearth. Because the warmth reached everywhere evenly. That was what shocked them most. Traditional cabins always had cold zones. Corners that froze. Floors that chilled your feet before dawn. Not here. The stored heat radiated outward slowly from the stone, and iron like sunlight trapped inside the walls themselves. Caleb sat quietly near the hearth watching the boiler casing tick softly behind the masonry. You built a battery, he realized. Gideon smiled faintly. For heat, yes. The storm continued through the night. At one point, Gideon stepped outside briefly to reload the firebox beneath the awning covering the outdoor boiler section. The wind hit like knives. Snow blasted sideways so hard, he could barely see the woodpile 10 feet away. Yet the system itself worked perfectly. That was another advantage nobody had understood before. Fueling the fire happened entirely outside. No smoke indoors. No ash spreading across floors. No massive heat loss every time the stove door opened. He fed the fire hard for 20 minutes, then returned inside. And once again, the warmth simply held. Morning came pale and brutal. When the storm finally weakened enough to open the door safely, the valley looked buried alive. Drifts reached halfway up cabin walls. Several roofs had partially collapsed. Chimneys leaned at dangerous angles beneath packed ice and snow. Most homes still burned frantic fires trying to recover warmth lost overnight. Gideon's cabin remained steady, warm enough that frost had barely formed along the windows. People leaving that morning carried the same expression. Not disbelief anymore. Recognition. Because winter had explained the system more clearly than Gideon ever could. By afternoon, word spread across the valley. The boiler cabin stayed warm all night, with barely any fire. The walls themselves held heat. The floor stayed warm until morning. Smoke never filled the room because the firebox stayed outside. And perhaps most importantly, nobody inside spent the night fighting winter. That changed everything. Over the next weeks, people visited constantly. Not to mock. To learn. How much water stayed inside the boiler? How thick should stone walls around it be? Did iron crack from repeated heating? Could smaller systems work too? Gideon answered patiently. Not everyone needed a railroad boiler welded into their home. But everyone could learn the principle. Store heat. Don't just create it. That idea spread fast. Caleb added extra masonry around his father's stove. Harlan built stone benches near his hearth to absorb warmth longer. Several families began using water barrels near fires to stabilize indoor temperatures overnight. The valley slowly stopped building homes that depended entirely on constant burning. Then spring arrived. Snow softened. Roofs dripped. Smoke thinned. One evening Caleb stood outside Gideon's cabin watching sunset glow against the old iron boiler beneath its awning. They laughed at you for hauling this thing here, he said. Gideon ran one hand along the weathered metal shell. It laughed at winter longer than they did. Caleb grinned at that. Because now the whole valley understood something they hadn't before. Heat was not just about fire. It was about keeping what you already made. And long after the hardest winter passed, travelers entering the valley still noticed the strange cabin with a massive steam boiler welded into its wall. Most expected it to look foolish. Instead, they found the warmest home in the valley. Built from an old machine everyone else had abandoned.